Have you ever wondered why the standard work week in most Western countries tends to be somewhere around 40 hours per week? To better understand why this might be the case, it's useful to focus on how this idea came to be in the United States in the 20th century. Of course, every country has had its own set of struggles and movements behind work time, but the story of work time in the United States illustrates very well the kinds of struggles and issues that workers have come up against whilst attempting to improve conditions and contracts in the workplace in a highly capitalist society. Capitalism essentially preys upon time as a commodity. Modern work time must be understood through the lens of capitalism. Because work occurs within the dimension of time, workers in effect sell their time in exchange for wages. Once their time is sold, the workers' time belongs to employers, who dictate and control work time schedules, as well as going to great efforts to ensure that all time purchased is filled with productive work, regardless of social concern or the well-being of workers. It has taken the struggle of workers, organisational changes, and legislative reforms over the courses of the 19th and early 20th centuries in order to arrive at the standard 40 hours work time per week in the United States. If it weren't for these efforts, workers would likely be working a lot more than 40 hours per week as a national standard. Before the 1930s, most American workers were working beyond 40 hours per week as a standard. Henry Ford was one of the first industrialists in the early part of the 20th century to argue that fewer working hours could generate more time for people to consume to benefit the economy. Note that Ford cared very little about increased leisure time for workers. His focus was purely about capitalist economics. Ford used this argument as a tactic to disarm organised labour movements, who were by this time trying to explore reducing work hours. Other wealthy capitalists and large businesses did not share the same perspective as Henry Ford. With little support from other employers, Ford tried to encourage Woodrow Wilson to enact an 8-hour workday as a national standard for the United States, but Wilson refused in light of disagreements from the business community. So, Ford began experimenting with a 5-day workweek within his own company in 1922. However, some workers saw this as a way for Ford to slow down production, as during this time there were cuts in wages and a reduced demand for cars. No other large corporations followed this approach. The next development came about during the Great Depression in the late 1920s. The Communist Party and the trade union Unity League organised unemployed people during this time into unemployed councils, who then organised national protests and demonstrations, calling for an unemployment insurance bill, an end to evictions, and a work week to be legally established of 5 7-hour days per week, with a 6-hour day for dangerous jobs and no reductions in wages. Following on from these national demonstrations, there was now a focus within labour unions on reducing work time. The American Federation of Labour held a convention in 1930 to discuss the 5-day work week. As a consequence of the convention, members of the American Federation of Labour urged President Hoover to arrange a conference between labour leaders and industrial leaders to explore the adoption of a 5-day work week and 6-hour day. Not much became of this though, probably because industrial leaders disagreed. Seeing no further developments towards a proactive stance on reducing work time on the part of employers, the American Federation of Labour instructed a US Senator, Hugo L. Black, to introduce a bill to Congress that established a 30-hour working week as a national standard for workers across the country. The 30-hour bill was eventually introduced to the Senate in March 1933, and it passed with 53 votes to 30 the following month. Supporters of the bill cited forward-thinking arguments associated with the need to reduce working hours in order to make way for improved machine automation over time, and to help recover the economy from the Great Depression by reducing unemployment. 11 days after the 30-hour bill was approved by the Senate, it entered the House of Representatives. The House Labour Committee acted favourably, and Representative William P. Connery Jr., chair of the committee, urged House passage. Most employees in the United States, represented by the National Association of Manufacturers, opposed the 30-hour bill. Franklin D. Roosevelt also opposed the bill, stating it was unworkable and unconstitutional, and believed that another legislation, called the National Industrial Recovery Act, would help to reduce work hours more rapidly and boost wages. Through administrative pressure, the 30-hour bill was buried and never resurrected. Later, the National Industrial Recovery Act, favoured by Roosevelt, became adopted in June 1933. This act gave a voice to workers over influencing the conditions of work and included a maximum legally permitted number of workdays. One of the codes of this act permitted a declaration of a national state of emergency for employees to organise and negotiate with employers to establish better work conditions. Employers initially refused to negotiate with the many independent trade unions representing many workers across the country, and workers' strikes ensued due to a lack of progress in these negotiations by employers. As a result of these strikes and the large work stoppages, the US Supreme Court in May 1935 nullified the National Industrial Recovery Act, removing a voice away from the workers and giving power to the employers over work conditions. Immediately and unsurprisingly, the employers reverted back to extending work hours and reducing wages. By this time, Roosevelt was reportedly disappointed to see an extension of work hours, and regretted not supporting the 30-hour bill back in 1933. By 1938, during the Roosevelt administration, the Fair Labor Standards Act was signed into law. This act initially established a maximum working week of 44 hours, and was later reduced 2 years later to 40 hours per week. A minimum wage was guaranteed, as well as overtime paid at time and a half. Employers were strongly against the Labour Standards Act, with some calling it a direction towards communism and fascism. Some corporations disliked it so much that they challenged the legislation in court on constitutional grounds and ultimately failed. Since the establishment of the 40-hour workweek provision in the Fair Labor Standards Act, labour unions were hesitant to reinvigorate the 30-hour workweek bill during the Cold War era, being concerned about an association with the Communist Party, who were still keen to reduce work time. In the early 1960s, J.F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson advocated against a reduction in work hours, citing that the war on poverty could only be won through economic growth and the creation of new jobs. Now, in light of the fact that we live in an age where technological progress is improving year by year, and the advent of sophisticated AI that has the ability to take over many jobs from workers today, is it time for the world to seriously consider reducing work time and make way for a universal basic income?